Anyway, let's get into lesson 3 here. Mixers and the art of mixing. You want to have the slides, right? In fact, let's pass both of these around. I'm giving you an opportunity to thank you, Bob, to have the manual of this mixer. A lot of times our mixer manufacturers have a lot of information in these manuals. Sometimes the manuals don't, they're like a sheet of paper with 8 languages on them. Other times, like in this case, this particular mixer, there's a lot of good information in there that you can actually study the manual and learn a lot about what's going on. So there's not going to be any tests on that manual or anything else. It's just for your own curiosity. You're wondering what this knob does. There's explanations for it in there. In fact, there's examples of how to set up stuff and things like that. Some really good information in there. So I just wanted you to have that. So there won't be any test on the manual, but certainly feel free to read the manual, which is against many of our nature too. So, okay. All right. So we got the notes out. We're ready to go. We're going to be talking about the mixing console or mixer. Mixers come in a lot of sizes, shapes, and flavor. The mixer is the control center of our sound system. That's the nerve center. I got some words mixed up there, sound kind of funny. But it's the nerve center of our system. That's where you sit when you're running a sound system live. Now, in the smaller churches, you don't necessarily have somebody actually running sound, but it's still the place where all the sound goes through. The microphones enter, signal processing takes place, there's amplifiers out there, but most of what you do is on what we call the board or the mixer. Okay, so you have a large mixer. This happens to be the one we're using as our example here in class. You have smaller mixers too. In fact, they can get pretty small and relatively simple. I mean, for some churches, this is all you need. Go ahead and pass that around. Yeah, just very simple little mixers. They're fairly inexpensive. They do the job. They have enough adjustment to get your church going. So there's nothing wrong with that. But we're not talking about that kind of mixer. This is not a home ec class. This is another class for sound. So that makes its own sound, but not the kind we're interested in. All audio, all sounds are run through the speaker, or excuse me, through the mixer before being sent to the speakers. So it comes from our microphone, goes into the mixer, we make our adjustments, and then goes out of the mixer, amplifier, and then to our speakers. And that's, we got it set up in a very small configuration here, but we have a complete system this way too, with that being the central part of it. Even though a mixer looks complicated, this is something you need to take away from here, most of the controls are simply the same thing repeated for the number of channels in the mixer. If we take this part of the board all the way from here to here, between these two sections, and you look up and down it, you're going to find this knob does the same thing as this knob, which does the same thing to this knob, and so on, with respect to different channels, we call them. Okay? So we talked about channel. I just mentioned that word channel. A channel represents a single source of sound, such as a microphone, CD player, or instrument direct input. So it's any single source of sound is a channel. So wherever we have a microphone, or we're putting off a CD player like we have up there, or whatever, that is a source of sound. Thank you, Adrian. We use the term channel strip because it's kind of like a strip going up and down there. All the controls, knobs, switches, faders, these are called faders, we'll talk about those a little bit later on, and indicators, you'll see some little lights and things here. And then we also have, this can be considered part of the channel strip as well, the meters that are facing you and are part of that channel strip, okay? And they enable you to control what's going on in that particular microphone, particular sound source. Our channel strip is rather long, so we've broken up the picture of it into two sections here, which actually starts here, goes up, and then up here, which is the same thing you can see on that. Controls are grouped. That's an important thing, is to try to keep it so our brain gets our hands to go to the right knob at the right time. We have groups of controls, and we're going to go over those groups, but just really quickly here, we have a preamplifier gain with an associated switch. We have what we messed with that first lesson, which is the equalization. We have auxiliary sends here. These we'll talk about as we go through here. In this particular mixer, we won't be talking about these today, but these have to do with an extra 24 channels that can be used in a variety of ways. So this can actually handle up to 48 signals. Then we have our main fader and some switches that send things off to our master section for subgroups, they're called, muting buttons and a couple of buttons associated. So they're grouped in different functions. The most used controls are always kept at the bottom. So faders are what we do the most of when we're running a service. And there should be very little adjustment of the other controls. We want to, like we talked about before, we have a setup time where we just install the wire and we get the system there, or maybe we're doing a tune-up, if you would, and we have that time where we're getting the board set up, that we might be doing some pretty aggressive changes and things to make it sound right. We get it close, then first service comes up, and we notice that there's a little bit, it's a little too shrill on the pastors, so we knock down that high just a little bit. But we're doing small adjustments during the service. The big things happen when we do our setup. Okay. Inputs, microphone or line inputs, which are on the back here, are on the back of this mixer. You'll notice in a lot of these smaller mixers, they're on the top. Okay, and these are the connectors where things come in. And if you came around this side, and they are illustrated in the manual, and as we go through our slides, we'll see some of that. There's a bunch of connectors on the back, keeping them out of the way so that they're hooked up and we're going to do our thing. Input levels must be matched to the source. That's a key in operation and setting up a system and then operating the system. We must match our input to our source or we're going to have some pretty lousy sound. So we have microphones. A microphone sound is probably the weakest signal that you'll have in the system, the lowest voltage, especially a dynamic. Coming out of these dynamics, that's why you notice when we had the condenser mic, when we were doing the microphones last week, that was much louder for the same settings because it has an amplifier in it. So you have weak signals from microphones. We have preamplified microphones like that condenser mic was. That's going to be a bigger signal. We have what we call high-level sources, such as instruments. If the instrument is not coming through a direct box, that's a key there too. It could be instruments. Like if we had a small church and we had an electric piano sitting right over there, you don't need a direct box. Just plug it into line input because you don't have a long line to pick up all that hum. Okay, the wire is short. If it's short wires, you don't need a long line. So it could be an instrument. CD players, I think those are the hottest things, aren't they, Tom, that we've run into on systems. For some reason, they love to make CD players with huge signals that come out. And we have to do everything we can to turn them down. And then sometimes the faders are just barely off the stop running those things. But they're really hot. And there's other things too that can come into what we call high-level sources. So we have these different things that have to be come in and matched to our mixer so that the sound is doing the best possible thing. Improper input matching leads to, okay, if we don't, we got extreme noise and distortion. You'll have a really grungy, grinding sound, and every time the preacher talks, it's going on because it's distorted. It could be extreme noise and distortion. Or, if we're on the wrong end of it, all you hear is and hissing and a little bit of sound there too. So that's too low. It can cause damage to the mixer. So you can actually blow out inputs of the mixer if you do an extreme enough signal goes in there. So you got to be careful with that. You can damage whatever the source is if you do something wrong there too. Again, we want to make sure we match our inputs. Now, the preamplifier, and a lot of these terms, people in sound systems, just like people everywhere, like to shorten things. So you'll see a lot of these abbreviations, MIC or mic for mic. Preamplifier is called a preamp. Save a syllable or two. We boost very low-level signals, normally a microphone signal, using a preamplifier or preamp in the console. So all we have to worry about with most mixers is we just plug them in with our little 3-wire input. We just plug it in, and inside there's a preamp. There are some mixers that don't have those, but they're few and far between nowadays. And the preamp should never be driven to distortion. Now, let me stop and explain just a little bit here at this point. Is we notice we have a preamp level adjustment up here, and we have a level adjustment back down here. One of the keys to setting it up is getting these two balanced with each other. Okay, if this is designed to take a very weak signal and make it much stronger, and most of them, when they design those, they run them, and I don't want to get really technical on us here, but they run them in a different mode that when it distorts, it makes really nasty noise. If if it distorts further down in the console, it's not as nasty. And that has to do with the way the circuits are designed. For those of you that have a little bit of technical background, it's like a Class A versus a Class C amplifier, excuse me, Class B amplifier. So you have, in other words, when it distorts, let me chase that a little bit, because even though this is not going to be anything on a test or anything like that, a preamplifier can distort where our wave is coming down here, and it should come down like this, and here's our nice little wave. It can distort here, but not, but the other end might be way up there. It's not symmetrical, so we chop off this part of the waveform. Where the rest of the circuitry is going to distort it. Okay, so this is our normal signal, it's fine. Let's suppose we turn the sound up and this is our ends there. It's going to distort it symmetrically. This sound is much worse than that sound, bottom line. In fact, in this particular console, it gives a real loud popping sound. It'll give a snapping sound. And it has to do also with the way the signal's coupled in the amplifier. So just, you know, from that discussion, the only thing that you really need to know is you don't want these things to distort. Okay? And you do not want the preamplifier level stuff, which is generally the XLR connector used with high-level sources. You have another connector on most of these consoles called a line input, and that's what's meant for those great big signals coming from the CD player and from those kind of things too. So, we all following so far? Okay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about input matching. Example, we have a dynamic or a condenser microphone. Where are we going to hook it up? We're going to take it from the microphone input and we're going to plug it right in there. If it's a condenser mic, remember phantom power. I'll have a slide about that in just a moment. But all we do is plug it in there on the front of the console. So we've plugged this in the back. This is a picture of the back. In the front of the console, we have this switch here. Excuse me, that's the back of the console. That's the front. Okay, I'm looking at the wrong spot here. We have a switch here that allows us to set it for mic or line. That's what I was looking for. And they have this is arranged a little differently. That was what was throwing me off a bit. There's a mic line switch, so we have to have the switch set in the position for the microphone. Now, I see what they did. We have a different model console. Those switches are on the back. So these two switches are actually on the back, and this stuff here is on the front. So between here and there, that very top part is on the back. There's a mic line switch. That's what I was going for. Okay. Okay, so everybody past my confusion there? So we have to push a button on the back that says mic or line here. Out for mic, in for line. We might have to adjust this other switch here, which is called, and it's not clear on that, but it's an attenuator. So now I'm using that condenser mic. It's got a preamplifier, and that thing's really hot. Okay, really hot meaning really loud. We'll use the term hot. So now I've got my phantom power running. I got that thing in there, but boy, when you talk into that microphone, it blows everybody's hair away. So what we do is we press this other button down, which is called minus 20 dB, and it brings the signal down, but we're still using the XLR because that's the kind of connector it is. We don't want to use that for our CD player. Okay, once we have it plugged in, then we use the trimmer here, which is on the front of this console, to set our level where we need it for the rest of the circuitry there. We're going to show you that in a minute. And like I said before, if you're using a condenser mic, you want to make sure you use that phantom power. There's a switch on this console, it's back here, and it runs 8 channels at a time. And another footnote, about phantom power to remember is that when you have phantom power on one of these microphones that doesn't need phantom power, it's harmless. It doesn't do anything. It's even hard to get a shock of it. You can get a shock, but you have to really work at it to do so. So in other words, if I have one microphone that's a condenser on it, this group of 8, and all 8 turn on when I press that phantom power button, then it doesn't matter. I'm still getting phantom power of the one microphone I need to. Now, if you have 0 microphones, it's best to leave that switch off. That are 0 condenser microphones, or 0 microphones that require phantom power. Okay? Questions? All right. Let's talk a little bit more. Now we got a high-level input. I'm going to take that MP3 player. I'm going to take this thing, and I'm going to hitch it up. So take my iPhone, I plug it in, and I'm going to put sound to the mixer. What do I do there? Okay, that switch again, and now on this mixer has to be in the the in position. There's a little triangle pointing down on that. It has to be pushed in so it will select the line in as opposed to the XLR connector. So it's going to select that line in connector, which has a connector that looks like that. Okay, a different looking connector. And by the way, they make these adapters that if you don't, did I go backwards? I did, didn't I? I felt myself push that. That if you have like if you have a CD player and you have one of these, but you need to get into your console, these are always good to have in your little grab bag. Put one of those guys on, and now it's ready to go. Okay. I went too far. Forget for pressing the wrong button. Okay. So now we're going to hook that up. We've got that connector. We've pushed in that switch so it's on the line instead of mic. We again adjust this. This trimmer still has control over the level of sound. Yes?
What are you looking at or monitoring in order to know that that is adjusted properly?
We'll get there. We're working on that. We're coming up on that. I got a little bit of time yet here. Only one at a time. Some mixers, if you do that, if you plug in both of those connectors, they're wired together and you can push a signal back out into that microphone. Not all of them. Some mixers are wired that way. So just one at a time. It's kind of like the old joke about the heavy man on the scale. One at a time, please. Okay. Signal to noise ratio, or SNR. That simply is the ratio of what we want to hear, all that sound coming through the system, versus unwanted noise, which can be a hiss sound, or it can be a hum is very common to get, especially when you have really long wire runs like you do in larger churches like ours. The ratio of good to bad. So we want really big, good signal, and really small, bad signal. A preamplifier adjustment is critical to maximizing the SNR. These are these knobs that John was asking about here. Okay. Ideal adjustment is when the fader section distorts, the distortion that we talked about here, when the signal gets so big that it hits the voltage limit of that thing, when the fader section clips or distorts just before the preamplifier does. We want this guy to distort before this guy distorts. A little bit techie here. This is actually taken out of the manual. It's the block diagram showing our XLR, our line input, feeding to the preamplifier. This little circle around here is that fader adjustment, which was this knob here. Okay, goes through some other circuitry, comes out here. Here's our other fader, what we call the fader, which is the main slider here, and then the rest of it's going through that other stuff there. What we want to do is we want the signal that comes, that little tiny signal goes through the preamp, becomes a bigger signal, and is not a whole lot bigger when it goes through the fader. We want to match those levels so that there's a lot of signal going through this part of the circuitry that's not too big or too small. Okay, that's what a proper adjustment looks like. An improper adjustment, okay, if we clip our preamp, and I didn't show that asymmetrical clipping I was talking about where one side does the other, but we get some very nasty distortion. Just keep that in mind. If I've dialed that thing up so it's making a sound every time I talk, then there's nothing I can do with any of this other stuff to get rid of that sound. I can turn this thing down, way down, and it's still going to be distorted. I want to turn that knob down so that it's not clipping there. Okay? If the preamp is too low, okay, now I got a little tiny signal. I tried to draw a picture that's kind of tiny, actually really tiny. Now whatever noise and distortion and all that stuff we talk about, the signal to noise ratio that's coming from these circuits in between here and here gets in there, and now I have my signal, but I have a bunch of noise on there that's taking away from the clarity of the sound. Okay, so that's where if we turn it down too low. Now the key here, okay, let's go back to this. The key here in that adjustment is that what we want to do, and we talk about it a little bit later here too, but I want to get to this point, is we want, ideally during the service, that slider to be at the 0 setting. That is designed that everything before it is going to have the right level if we're at 0 during the normal operation of that microphone. So we don't want it way down, and we don't want it way up. Way up is going to be more noise. That's not as critical, not as much of a problem, but it can be a little bit of a problem. If it's way down, especially if it's down in these lower ranges here, you will definitely clip that amplifier. You'll hear some really nasty sounds and I've had that happen because a good example is in our church, Pastor Paisley, like we talked about before, likes to hold his microphone very close to his mouth. He also likes to use the handheld wireless microphone. Okay, that microphone is set up during the song service for what I call a farther field, farther away. Pastor Griffin is 3 feet away from the microphone, and we want to pick him up loud enough that we can hear when he steps off the side when he's leading singing. So we take that microphone, and then Pastor Paisley does it during the regular preaching service. He grabs it and he puts it this far from his mouth. Now it's way louder like this than it is like that. What'll happen sometimes if he gets really loud on that microphone and we haven't done anything with the mixer, we're running that slider down, maybe down 1/3 the way up or something, and he hits a loud spot, you hear that really loud crack. So what we try to do during the service is we'll take that one I've been using this one as an example, so we'll dial this one down, and then we'll get this back up to that 0. Once it's 0, we're in the clear as far as the mixer itself distorting. Now he can still distort other parts of the system, but the mixer will be set right. So the ideal way to set that is to set it so that the level is such that this is all you can do within the mixer, that the level is running at 0 for your ideal, normal, everyday sound coming out from that sound source. So that's the key on that too. Hopefully that answers your question, of how we get these levels set right. Still a little foggy? Still a little bit. Well, it could be anything. It could be microphone. Yeah, let's start with this. So let's see. This is number 2. Tell me if I get feedback, Bob. Testing 1, 2. Not a whole lot of sound there. I think I need more preamp, right? So what I want to do is I want this set here, and then I'll take and adjust this until I get the sound that I want right there. Now this is a weak microphone because you can see how high it is, and you really don't want to be right at the top of that preamp. But at this level, I'm getting pretty decent level of sound. So let's suppose that that's the level we want to have in the room from this far from my mouth. I've just set my preamp to that level by setting that at 0 and dialing this around. Well, that's too loud there. But most of these, when you get to the very top of them, you don't want to be there. There's some other problems that happen, and that's what's happening. These dynamic microphones are actually one of the lowest output microphones I'm familiar with, so they need a lot of gain. I need to make sure I don't have any buttons wrong there. They're all set right. So that's basically how you do it. Now, if we're going to use a different source, before I get a problem there, looks like my phone just picked up some more email. So this is that, and let's try not to blast our ears out. Okay, I've got it switched to line. The pad doesn't make a difference, but we're going to take and dial this down so we don't have any problems there. Bring those 2 up, unmute them, and any sound? It says on. Okay, unmuted. They are on line. This used to work. Oh, you know what? You have to turn the phone off of its mute. Good thing I didn't blast you totally out. But actually, you see, these are turned all the way down in what I'm getting. So this is a very strong signal. So let me see if I can. I'm going to turn down my source because it's so hot. You see this? So I can set this wherever I want if this is for what it would be a normal level. Or we could try to find, we could find some sounds or whatever we want here too. What I have on this thing, we could go to our Cricket. That's a little loud. So anyway, we get our sound gone through there. We would put our sound in. If it's a CD, we're going to play the CD. If it's a preacher, pulpit, whatever, and we're going to try to adjust this so that we can keep this level at 0 when we're working with it. And this is actually very similar to the CD in its output level. It's very, very hot. Just discovered that. There's no way to reduce it enough within the console. If you get in that situation, they do make little connector things that you can put on that are what they call attenuators. That can drop that signal down some more for you. Or you could use that DI box. That'll work too. Okay, how are we doing? A little more understanding there, hopefully. Let's move on to our equalizer. Equalizers are used to adjust the sensitivity to frequencies or pitch by boosting or increasing or cutting or decreasing response at certain frequencies. This is a little bit of a review from what we did on our first lesson, but I want to make sure we understand this well. The equalizer, and this applies to the channel strip, this statement here, so make sure that remember we're talking about the channel strip. They're only used to adjust frequency response of individual sources. We're going to have a response from our speakers. We're going to have a response from different parts of our system, maybe some of the processing it goes through. We're going to have some settings that we're going to have to reduce the chance of feedback in the overall system. Those kind of adjustments are done elsewhere. They're not done in these. These are meant to adjust this microphone or my MP3 player or whatever to balance it into the system, which already has its response set elsewhere. Does that make sense? We're working on just the individual source when we adjust frequencies. Straight up means no adjustment on any of the ones that have a level. Obviously not a frequency, but a level. That means it's no boost and no cut, or what we call flat for that particular adjustment. Little sidebar, if you would. Detent is just simply if you turn many of these knobs, they will stop or feel like they want to stop in the middle. That's to give you the indication of where the zero setting is. So as you move many of these adjustments, you'll feel this little detent in the knob. See if these have any of them. So if you take the balance knobs on this, you'll feel that detent. Move those back and forth. That's the second knob up, just to give you an idea what detent feels like. There's nothing wrong with that knob. That's what it's supposed to do. Okay, on our mixer, we have 4 different equalization settings. Actually 5 if we count this high pass, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, and we call those bands, or frequency bands. They can either be fixed, we talked about this earlier, or parametric. So this high one has a fixed frequency that it works at. It only works at one frequency. This mid one allows us to choose both the amount of booster cut and where we do the booster cut. That's a parametric. And actually they're called semi-parametric because there is a third adjustment of how wide, but most mixers don't have those. When you're adjusting EQ, you want to avoid excessive boosting. Normally you're going to be trying to go after a problem frequency. You're not going to be trying to improve it. The general exceptions to that would be in your lowest and highest frequencies. You may want to add a little what they call warmth with bass. That's rare in most of our services, but you may want to do that. Many times somebody will sound a little bit muffled and you want to add a little bit of highs to them. Most of the time the response to the microphones, the response to the systems and everything else is pretty strong in the mid-range anyway, so you don't want to add more mid-range to that. You get some pretty nasty sounds. However, that said, now we're setting up our system. We're not regular church service. The best way to find a problem frequency is to boost the gain of the equalizer, then adjust the frequency until it becomes worse. So you make the problem worse when you're doing setups. So I've got this ringing I'm hearing. Okay, where is that frequency? Yeah, you can try to use some equipment to find that frequency, but the very easiest way to find it is, empty auditorium. We don't have people in there. It's ringing a little bit. I take and I adjust. I boost it up a little bit, and I started sweeping that frequency until it hits it, and then it gets really bad. Then I know that's the frequency. Bring it down, and it goes away. So I don't know if we can do a scenario here without blasting out your ears, but let's give it a shot. Let me try my red microphone. It might be a little bit better. And then we'll break after this. Let you go recover your hearing. Okay, 1, 2, 1, 2. So let me set this flat first. Ooh, there she comes. Ooh, okay. Okay, so high, low, mid, where are we at? Any guesses? I think it's about 400 hertz, somewhere around there. So this one's dialed to 250, so let's try that one. Okay, we're definitely making it worse. Oh, just changed the frequency, so that's not it. That's a lower one. Hello, right there. That's the one. Gone. So dial up the frequency. When you hear the same tone, notice we had a different tone there. Yeah, I like that. Talk on the microphone too. Yep, it's still there if you do too much. Dial it up some, and then go find that frequency. And when you hear the same tone, you say, ah, now I got it. Turn it down, and away goes the problem. You don't want to do that in the middle of service, okay? Keep that in mind. Pastor, I was just helping you out. I wanted to make sure I could get rid of that ringing, so we had to turn it up first. Martin said so. Okay. We'll take a break now, and then we'll talk about the fader when we get back. Okay, time to talk about the fader. The fader is the most frequently used control during a service. On our board, maybe the mute buttons, but the fader is actually probably slid up and down more and more. Faders come in different flavors. On a lot of these smaller mixers, you're going to find a rotary knob. Rotates back and forth. That's the fader level. That's just a level is all it is. We call them faders for the sliders, but we'll give it a generic name as we go through this discussion of fader, or they can be the sliders like we have here. We talked about this a little bit earlier. The ideal setting is 0 dB or unity. We want to be right there. We use the preamp gain, again the knob at the top on this particular mixer, to adjust them. This one has, even this little board has, for the microphone inputs, has those same kind of idea. Okay. So mixing during service should be up and down from 0. So we want 0 to be our starting point. If a singer's a little quieter, we turn it up. Singer's a little louder, or preacher's a little louder, whatever, we turn it down, up or down from 0. 0 is where we want to be. We may not be there all the time, but that's the ideal situation. That's where we want to have that thing set. The panoramic knob, we'll talk briefly about that. A mixer can be run in a stereo mode. That means it has a left and a right channel. Right now we have a left and a right speaker. So a pan knob controls how much of that signal goes to the left or right channel. Okay? And it's great for like the song service when you're recording or broadcasting this signal. You see, I think I hooked this up this time. I didn't last time to be able to use it this way. I don't know if you can be able to hear. Testing 1, 2. Can you hear me out of one side? Well, we're getting one or none. So we're not working right here. That should be going left and right, but we're not going to be doing. Oh, I know why. This is not what you do in the middle of service. Okay. Duck underneath the table and find that bridging button. Turn off the amplifier so we don't blow everybody's ears out. Change the bridging. I had that thing set up so that it could be able to drive the speakers at the same signal. And so now, which is called bridging. So now let's see what it does. Testing 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Can we hear different speakers? Looks like I got them backwards, but they do work. So there they go. And you want to have your signals going the right direction so you know what they're doing. But that's a pan knob. Okay, so in this case, it's all the way over on my left or your right, and vice versa over here. Now, turn that off so we don't blow our ears out. Grab pointer. Okay, so what do we do with a pan knob? We set it up so we have some, we can take in our image, our stereo image, as we're listening to this maybe on a set of headphones, maybe with a pair of speakers in front of us, we can move a particular singer from right to left, wherever we want to put that person in that image. So if I have a trio, for instance, I can put the melody in the middle, and I can put the lower harmony on the right, and on the left I can put the upper harmony, the soprano, or whatever. So you can do that, and you get a very nice sound with two speakers for stereo. However, what happens if we use it in our auditorium? Okay, now I've got a speaker over on this corner of the room, and I got one over on this corner of the room, and I got people spread out all over the room. The only people that hear the right blend are going to be in the middle. So we should never be using stereo in an auditorium. Believe me, I built a mixer for our auditorium. I told you about a number of years ago, around 82 or so, and the first thing I did was, stereo, great. And then after the first service, people are complaining on the piano side, can't hear the organ. And on the organ side, can't hear the piano. Okay, flip the switch, make it mono, and all of a sudden, everything's great. So mono means one signal going everywhere. Okay, that's what we use in our auditoriums. It's a very rare circumstance that I can't think of any in a church service where you want it to be in stereo. But if you have a radio station like we do, or if you're recording for you're going to make a CD of some of your songs during your special service or whatever, those pan knobs can come in handy. Now you can use them like if you just do a special recording session, or you can do like we've done here where we're using some of the extra features of the mixer to give us a mono output to the auditorium and a stereo output for broadcast or recording. So never use them in the auditorium. And almost goes without saying, but we've got to think about that. We should always have the preacher equal at both speakers. Whatever you do, you don't want to have them on just one side or the other side of the auditorium. You know, you want that word of God to be heard everywhere. A lot of mixers have a mute button. This one does not. But this one does in many of the higher end and mid-level mixers. Even the $400 mixers that are between these two sizes have mute buttons, which are really handy. What a mute button does is it silences the channel regardless of the fader setting. Okay, so we'd all be plugging our ears if I went like this and this, but no sound because my mute button's pressed. But if I do it this way, you don't want me to do that. We'll have some pretty loud noises. So the mute button keeps any signal from that channel going the rest of the way through the mixer. That's what a mute button does, no matter where we have the fader at. A lot of times we'll preset our faders, and we have a series of fader levels, and some of them do go up and down from that 0 that we use in our auditorium. They're fairly close to it, one way or the other. But there's some other reasons we've changed them around, just as a footnote. But once we have all those levels set, time for that trio to get up, they're grabbing the microphones. I don't want to hear them, because thump, 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 they're going to be, you know, what we call handling noise is going to be happening. Let's just do that here. So, you know, we're picking it up, we're holding it, we're moving around. We don't want that sound as they pull them out of the mic stands and so forth. So we leave it muted until right before they sing. Then we just open those up, and we're able to get them instantly. A lot harder to push up 3, 4, 5, 6 faders at the right time. And with our service going over broadcast, it helps a lot more too, because you got to remember that the way the broadcast equipment works is we talked about the dynamics of the service. You want to let the preacher be quiet or loud or whatever. Well, on a radio station, that's unacceptable. People are in a noisy car, they're listening, and they're just, you know, they got that radio up just loud enough to hear it, and they don't want to keep on messing with the volume. So the radio processing, we call it on the radio station, keeps the level constant. So if I have 8 microphones sitting there open, turned on, with nobody singing in front of them, all of a sudden all that background noise on the radio station gets pulled up because that's the only sound it has, and pretty soon we're hearing a bunch of noise. The mute buttons help a lot in that area, because what they do is they keep it quiet until right before you need the sound. If you get the timing down right, you can be pretty good sounding with a service, even though you have a lot of microphones. It's fun to turn 8 on at one time, isn't it, Kyle? You can do it. You don't even have to use the thumbs. Okay, we've already talked about this, keeping unused microphones silent, especially for broadcast and recording. Solo button. Solo button may be a new concept for some of you, but what it is, and I didn't bring my headphones over, which I should have, but what a solo button does is you press this button, and there's what's called either your pre-fader listener solo. There's 2 different versions of that. We'll talk about that in a minute. It routes it. You see another red light comes on over here, up so we can listen to it on our headphones. So now I can listen to the latest gossip on the stage before the service by hitting the solo button with my headphones on and say, oh, they're talking about Pastor Paisley up there, or whatever. Or you can listen and make sure that microphone is working. And that's the whole point of using the solo button. So part of our procedure before we start a service is we slap the headphones on and we run down that entire board for every microphone that's going to be used and make sure that microphone is working before the service starts. That's the purpose of a solo button. It's also helpful to use that, if I push the right button, it's also helpful to use the solo during a singing time when you have a number of singers up there and you're trying to figure out where is the person with the melody, which is sometimes hard to find, because I want to get that melody just a little bit louder to get a good blend coming through. So, and if you don't recognize the voices and you're not really used to it, you say, okay, is it this person? No, it's this person. Oh, that's the person with the melody. Now I can push that one up a little bit. And when you do that, it's all transparent to what's going out of the system. It's not interfering. Nobody else is hearing it but you. That's what the solo button is for, coupled with some good headphones. It's sometimes called a pre-fader listen. Now, all that means is that the solo button will go up or down in volume as you move the fader. if it's in a pre-fader listen mode, which in this mixer is set, where is it set? It's set over here on the main side. There's a lot of buttons that I'm reading upside down, but solo. Okay, anyway, here it is right here. Okay. You press this button one way and you get a pre-fader listen, which means it's unaffected by this. So I've got the slider all the way down, I can still hear it. That's the way we normally use ours, because I don't have to worry about the volume of the slider to know that I have my microphone working. If you use a true solo, it'll go up and down with that fader. So it just gives you the option of listening before or after the fader, depending on what your needs are. Okay, so even though the source is muted, you can still listen to it with a solo, which is really nice, very handy for making sure all of our stuff is working. On this particular mixer, we have peak and signal indicators, and a lot of these functions on this mixer you'll find on most of the boards, and this one has a lot of features, which is nice, allows us to talk about them, while some of our scaled down boards may not have it, but everything that's on this is on this. So anyway, peak and signal indicators are down here on this mixer. There's a red and a green light. The red light is like, stop, you're too loud. That means we're clipping the amplifier. That means we're pushing it too hard. Something is causing it to clip. It's too loud, something needs to be dialed down. And so there's something wrong. The signal indicator, which says -20 here, is set for a threshold of -20 dB from the peak, in other words. So it's at -20, we don't have to know what that number means. It's just a much smaller signal. So these are handy when pastors are there saying, give me sound. What's happening on the mixer there, Bob? Take a look at channel 2. So you're not hearing me, but you know the signal is getting there. So now I know I can reach for that spot and, oops, I forgot to turn on microphone number 2. Now I know where it's at. So you got a real handy way to see things with that signal indicator. There's the peak on this particular mixer. It's in the top. And preamp or channel overload. So if you have overload either way. So the way you deal with the peak is this knob or that knob needs to go down. Signal, again, have sound, will make noise. Shows that there's sound entering the microphone or coming from the source. Okay, so it's either the microphone or the source, depending on what's hooked up there. Here's an interesting one that starts getting a little bit deeper into things. We have these auxiliary sends. Aux is an abbreviation for auxiliary. They are essentially separate little mixing points within our console. So now not only do we have stuff going out to our main speakers, but now we have some other stuff that's over here that is sent to by these auxiliary knobs. Okay? We can use them anywhere we want to do something different with a mix. Well, what do we need to do that's different? I mean, I got sound in the auditorium. Well, what about those monitor speakers? Okay, I'm feeding, these used to be monitors before we put bigger speakers in for us. So I want to be able to send something to the singer, but the singer, the singers up front generally have a hard time hearing the piano when we mix it at the blend level that sounds good to the listeners in the auditorium. So the main speakers, the pianos may be a little quieter than the singers would like it because they're hearing themselves in the monitor. They want to hear that piano a little louder. So if we've assigned, let's say we've taken this number 2 microphone to that, and we're running the monitor using one of these auxiliary knobs, let's say it's just the number 1 knob, then we take this number 1 knob and we turn it up above that detent position, and now I'm feeding a stronger signal from the piano to what I've wired in their monitor off of this auxiliary send. The auxiliary sends come to these, go out these inputs and then can come in on some other inputs. So there's a lot of flexibility there, and I don't want to get too much into complexity, but now I have an opportunity to do something different with that mix that's very necessary for the best possible sound, because if my singers can't hear the piano, then they're out of time and everybody's plugging their ears during the song. So, and it's not really giving them the spiritual blessing they need. On many mixers, you can do pre or post fader. What does that mean? Okay, remember our fader. This is our fader here. Pre means that we're sending it before we make this adjustment, which means that this adjustment does not affect what the signal level is. If we do it post fader, then it follows. Okay? So it follows whatever I do with the main fader. We have the concept pre, ahead of the fader, post, after the fader. So pre-fader would generally be used in times when you're tapping off that signal and you don't care what the volume is in the main speaker. You want to keep it constant regardless of that. That's not a very common scenario in a church. Most of the time we want to adjust the volume of let's say the singers to correlate to a certain level of loudness that makes them blend well. So we're going to be doing that by sliding this fader up and down. So the amount of singer the pianist hears, and the pianist wants to hear herself less and the singers more. Now I need another one of these, by the way. I can't make them all happy at once, so I have multiples of these. So in that case, when I have the first singer up and they're singing quietly, and I have that fader dialed up, I don't want to have that pianist coming off her bench there because it's so loud. I want to turn that fader down, so I want this to follow what I do in that. That's a speaker, and she has her own volume control over there too. So she can control overall volume, but she cannot control the blend. So I've threatened to put a mixer there because it's my wife, and she always gets really picky about things. I hear about it when I get home. So yeah. So that feeds off the monitors. In our case, in our auditorium, we actually have 4 different mixes going to the monitors. And there's 8 speakers up there, which are really not enough. I mean, we still have some issues with monitoring. And what we do is we have, the way we've designed it is we do them in pairs because they're relatively symmetrical. So you have the pair in the middle that's by the pulpit, that's number 1. The next pair, which is towards where the singers normally stand, if they're off to the side, that's number 2. The ones that are pointed, the big speakers that are pointed diagonally towards the orchestra is number 3. Then the piano and organ get number 4. And so I can, fairly precisely hit a certain area by adjusting those 4 auxiliary sends. Now there's other things you can do with them, but in most of our churches, that's a very good use of those sends. Okay, so here's a picture of our sends we were talking about there too. And this little pre button is the one I was talking about. There's a pre and a post. Now on this particular mixer, they save some knobs. 3 and 4 can also be sent to 5 and 6. So you have actually 6 different sends with only 4 knobs, and you can say, okay, I want this one's 3 and 4 to go to 3 and 4, and I want this one's 3 and 4 to go to 5 and 6. You have that kind of flexibility. There's a lot of stuff you can do in there. Most of the time when you're running a service, it's not an issue, but when you're setting up, you can think through things. You say, I got to do something. I need to get this thing from here to there. Sometimes that kind of stuff is really handy to be able to do, and to know what's there is helpful. Okay, so we have a new mix for the auxiliaries. Again, we talked about the monitoring. We can run monitors, and then we can also use those for recording or broadcast where we have a different mix again. So we want different levels. In the auditorium, traditionally with when our piano was acoustic, with certain piano players which play really loudly, I remember getting a call years ago from Pastor Dobson up there in the PA telling me to turn the piano down on a certain piano player, and I said, it's all the way down, Pastor. That was just coming off the lid and the soundboard, and he was here getting blasted out by that. So, well, that's loud in the auditorium, but if there's nothing coming through the microphone, it's not going over the air. So I may want to dial up that signal a little bit over the air versus in the auditorium, because they have different sets of things going on in terms of what people are hearing. And all the people in the auditorium, they're hearing the direct sound off the platform, and they're hearing the PA, so there may be a different blend that I need from there versus going over the air. And if you're recording, it's the same issue. So even though you may not have a radio station in your church, you might be recording that song service for something special, like I said, a CD, or for people just to enjoy a later time, listen online or whatever. You want to try to get that blend closer. Again, those auxiliaries could come in really handy for that sort of thing. Yeah, in our case, what we do is we pretty much send everything. I mean, you could stop an input just by dialing it down. You dial it down all the way. Now that input cannot get anywhere. So if I don't want a certain signal in the monitor, but that's not the case with us. We want, we're pretty much having everything in the monitors. We just want them at different levels. Okay. So you can do that way. Now, The submix group work a little bit differently, but they give us a little bit more flexibility too. If you look at the mixer, you look at your illustrations there, or even the manuals I passed out, if you're farther away from the mixer, there's this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and then down below is the main mix. Those turn on and off the signals from those faders, from those channel strips, into, I'll call them knobs or faders over here. So they send signals over here for things that we can do other stuff with, okay? They allow us to group microphones for a particular action. Now, Kyle would love if I did this for his operation when he's operating up there. If I could reconfigure that mixer so that you just have to press one button to turn on eight microphones. That's what those things will allow you to do. The problem we have is we have to deal with a radio, and I can't do both at the same time. Otherwise, I might have done something like that. So we can turn a group of microphones on or off using those subgroups, and I'll show you how that works in just a minute. So you can also do recording. If you want to record a certain set of people but not another set of people, you can do that. Notice that each of those switches can be up or down, meaning that I can send something to 1 and 2 and the main mix, and then the next microphone over can go 3 and 4, 5 and 6 and the main mix. You can mix and match however you want to. Then there's effects processing, which are normally not used in our church environment. If you had a really dead room, remember we talked about the living room thing, and you wanted to add just a touch of reverb just to add a little bit of depth to the sound, particularly maybe during a song service or something like that, then you might use a reverb, for instance, as an effects processor. Generally, we don't advise for a traditional church to have much in the way of effects, because most of the time you're going to wind up muddying the sound. You don't normally want a reverb on a service. Okay, then when we move from there, we're going to kind of jump over from there because it's necessary for the explanation of how these subgroups work. We're going to look over this section here in the masters. There are 8 fader sliders here for these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If I press 1 and 2 on this, it goes to 1 and 2, and then I can do more things over here with that 1 and 2. So let's take an example. We want it 1 and 2 routing to groups 1 and 2. Okay, pan routes to first or second channel. Now, not only can I just route it to here, but I don't have to use it as a stereo. I can take that same panoramic knob, and if I turn that knob all the way to this side, and I press this 1, 2, now channel 1 is getting that signal. If I turn this all the way the other way, now channel 2's getting the signal. Okay, so I can actually turn this into 8 separate signals if I want to, in whatever combination of microphones I want. And again, for our purposes, what we're trying to do, the main thing is if you have to turn on a lot of microphones at once, you don't have the issue in this particular console where we have a radio mix coming out of there. We can do that, and we're going to show you that in just a minute. And we can also then we can take the group and send it to the main mix. So the solo enables you to monitor the mix on the headphones. So there's a solo button here. That's what we're after. That's why I was looking hard to see on that. Those diagrams didn't come out as clear as we'd like them to. There's a solo button at the very top. Okay, that's these buttons up here are solo buttons. And those allow us to take, okay, now I want to see what's going on, or I want to hear what's going on. When I sent those microphones to this, before I send them further, I can listen to that point in the system. So it gives you a kind of a monitoring point. You can go in, I'm going to be running this signal to this submixer, and then I'm going to be running it to my main mix. What does it sound like before it gets to the main mix? I can listen to that using the solo buttons here. Sounds pretty complicated, but let's just take an example. I'm going to take these 2 microphones, 1 and 2, and I'm going to run them. I'm going to turn them off the main mix, and I'm going to run them to the 1 and 2 inputs. I'm going to take the 1 and 2 inputs because I don't care about panning, so I'm going to run them in mono. So now what that does is that makes the same thing on both channels. I'm going to, okay, there we go. It works. Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and, either one of these turns it on, so I need to have less volume here because I don't know which one's doing which. So, okay, that one's quieter. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, I see what the problem is. We got to get all our settings right. We're going to have that forever, aren't we? 1, 2, 2. See, that the microphone's not set as high. There we go. 1, 2. Okay. Then if I take this and I just do, well, I don't even need that. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. No sound. So I'm turning on 2 microphones simply by setting one switch. And I could do that. I just have 2 microphones here. I could do that with 10 microphones, 20 microphones if I want to, all in one shot. So that's just an example of what those subgroups can be used for. We actually just use these channels for something else in our mixer because of the issue of dealing with a radio. But it is a little hard, even with 8 microphones in a row, to get your fingers on all the right spots on those mute buttons all at once and let them go. But we managed to do it. So, yes.
You were saying that with the pan buttons right here on these faders, if it's to the left, we'll send it, like on 1 and 2, we'll send it all to the first fader.
Yeah.
If it turned all the way to the left and all the way to the right?
Yes, you have to go all the way. Otherwise, you're going to feed a partial signal to. You're going to have a combination of those signals there too. And I put these on mono, which means that they were actually taking the signal from both channels, feeding it into both of these at the same time. Yes, and the pan's at 0, or this in mono will do the same thing. So if I hard pan that over there, if I turn it all the way to the left and I hit mono, I still have it on both channels. So.
I don't even know if this has anything to do with
Sure.
anything, but the combing, like you just have those 2 mics.
Yep.
Holding, and they're really close together in proximity, so that wouldn't matter with the combing.
Oh no, it would. You don't want to do that for real. Well, I'm just wondering if we can see if we can do that.
It sound bad, so I was curious.
Yeah, well, the way we're set up here, the speakers are way too close to the microphones to be able to do much, because I'm not really boosting the signal much before I get feedback. But let me, what am I doing here? 1, 2, okay, this. See, that's the opposite of a mute button. So that's the right direction there. So I'm going to come back here. We're going to get rid of those, and we're going to go back to our main mix. Bob's stepping back just in case I blast him there. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You should be able to hear a little bit of change in the sound. It's sort of a whooshing sound. Can you hear me now? Well, the hollow has to do with the equalization, I think, because we don't have this system balanced to this room. But when you do this kind of thing, I think it'd be easier if I had the headphones. So you go do this here, you get that cancellation. That's comb filtering. So everybody heard it but Keith. Did you hear it, Keith? I think so. Okay. So this is an example. It's obviously more obvious when you. That sounds good, doesn't it?
Okay, that's what I'm messing up. I was listening for a sound.
Yeah, it's a change or a distortion in the sound as we move back and forth. Okay. Okay. So that's comb filtering. And you ask why when the president speaks and he has 16 microphones up there, it doesn't happen. That's because each of those microphones is feeding something different. It's going to a different network. So just in case you were curious about that. Okay, so submix groups can be of some use, not really valuable for our basic church setup, but they can be of some use primarily in this sort of thing where we're trying to turn them on. So we did our example here already, so I got ahead of myself. Turn the main mix off. Submix is on. Mute is off on the individual channels, so we taken up at the top there's the mute buttons which aren't shown in that picture, and then we pan to the left. Now we switch that one to mono, and that gives us a feed to the same thing on making sure everything is coming down on both of those channels, and then the main button allows us to mute. Except the only problem is that instinctively we have mute down. These are the opposite. So with them, they would be on when they're down. So.
Now, in order to send the submix over, the main mix has to be off?
Nope. You can leave the main mix on, but you better be running that signal somewhere else, not to the main mix again. Because see, what we're doing is we're taking and looping it back into the main mix. So you would turn off the main mix so that you're not feeding it from 2 directions. Now, if you wanted that group, let's say, to go to a recorder, we're going to record the service. Or we're going to record it, but we don't want all the microphones. All we want is a couple of microphones. I want just the pastor's microphone. All I want is the preaching, let's say. Well, then we take number 1 and 2. We run, let's say we just push the 1 and 2 there. We run 1 and 2, 1 or 2 if you want to your MP3 recorder or your CD recorder or whatever. And you're not going to hear any of the song service. You're just going to hear whatever comes from that pulpit mic. You can do that kind of thing too. That's another use of those. That'd be good use of them. Okay. Okay, so those are submix groups. Remember that then your overall volume is going to be controlled by this fader here. if it's in our example. Okay, looks rather complicated. Certainly I can't read anything on that wall. That's called our master section. So now we've talked about most of the stuff here. I purposely left out the extra channels because it's not a common application, but based on what you've learned here, you could probably fish through that manual and study it out and find some use for those too. So we're talking about this section off to the side here. It's the control center of the console. So the console is the control center of our sound system. The center of the console is the master section. So it includes the control, the overall control for our loudness. This one on the far right here is the main loudness, feeding our main speakers in this case. And most of the time you would configure a mixer to use its main knob to control the overall loudness, not the blend. So you have your master controls. And there's a lot of different configurations for this, but they all have a lot of similarities. So if we learn one, we should be able to transpose that knowledge to another. Some of the things you'll find on these are like the auxiliary ascend masters. So all these knobs we were talking about here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the 4, 3, and 4 duplicated to 5 and 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these go to the aux sends, which then send the signal outside the console for something, if we want to use them for that, like to our monitors. So I could control, like we were talking about, let's suppose the piano monitor was number 1. I could control the blend feeding number 1 with these knobs, with these individual channel strip knobs. Then I can go over to this one and I can control the overall loudness of it. Just like the master or the main mix sliders on here would do the same thing for the house speakers, or what we call the main speakers, the house speakers. So that can control that. Returns. What are returns? Well, we send the signal out. In some cases we want to do something. Let's take that example. We're going to add just a touch of reverb because we've got this church that just has no reverb in it at all, and we want a touch of reverb during the song service. So we set up aux 1 to set out the levels that we want to feed that reverb unit with. We take and set the master level of it to be an appropriate level for the reverb unit to work with. It might need to be louder, might need to be quieter, whatever. Then we take the output of the reverb and we feed it back to an aux return. That brings it back into the console. And from there, the aux return, then we just press this button that says main mix on that, and we feed that to the main mix, and voila, we have reverb in our sound. So we send it out, we have these returns. Both of them have levels on them, knobs that you can control levels with. And it's important, again, similar to our explanation of how the preamp versus the fader gain is, that these levels be set so that all the equipment kind of plays happily together. There's indicators on the other equipment to look a lot of times to look for levels and things like that. And then there's your ears. It's noisy or it's distorted. And why? Well, play with those levels a little bit and see if that helps. Headphone outputs. This unit drives 2 separate headphone outputs. And there's some extra buttons on these headphones here that allow us to select what we want to hear. So there's, like we said here, we have these which are essentially different mixes. We could listen to some of those things. This has auxiliaries on it. Or we could listen to this main mix. And in some cases, depending on how it comes through all these switches, we can listen to these as well, either through the solo buttons or something else. There's a lot of different routing, if you would, that's available in some of these higher-end consoles. Monitoring. So again, the solo type of operation where we have those headphones on and we're trying to listen to a certain portion of our system. We can do that on that main side. Group outputs. Group, again, are these sub mixes coming out. We can take that group and we can send it out somewhere. And more. So there's a lot of stuff. And there's not anything really to memorize. It's the fact to understand there's a lot of flexibility in a lot of these mixing consoles or mixers that may be useful when you run into a problem. How do I get from this point to that point? Usually that's what happens is, okay, I got the basics. I've got a fader set. I've got a level set. I've got my EQ set. I know how to do that. Now I want to record a CD in a certain way and I can't get the signal. How do I get the signal to that CD? Or I want to run it through a compressor before I can put it on the CD, because a compressor is going to limit our changes in volume. And like we said with the radio example, you don't want to limit the volume normally in an auditorium environment where the preacher, you have some dynamics and the singers and orchestra and everybody's at full attention's there, but now somebody's driving down the road with their CD plugged in and you've recorded a CD that gets so quiet they have to turn it way up, and then the next time that orchestra crescendos and blasts them out and their ears are hurting, So you may want to do some extra things with those signals that you don't do with your other board, and that's where some of this other stuff comes in handy, okay? Every master section is going to have its main fader, whether it's simple. Don't press the buttons when you do that. Whether it's simple, we're going to have to go back here. That works. That really repeats good, doesn't it? Okay. There, hands off that. So whether we have a simple one or whether we have, a complicated board that has these extra sliders, they all have a master faders in them to control the overall level of the system. We talked about headphones. You can do all kinds of things with headphones where you can look at stuff without disrupting the service, anything else. We generally recommend that you use headphones and not a pair of speakers right next to you, because positioning, which we'll talk about later in the course, positioning the mixer is important, that the person running the mixer hears the service. Back in the old days, we didn't believe in that, so we just hit ourselves. But it makes a much better sound when the person that's running the mixer has got their ears in the service. The ideal place, in fact, is on the main floor, but that can be too much of a distraction for some people. Buses, and we're not talking about a bus ministry this time. A bus is a signal path composed of multiple signals that have been routed to a singular common destination. So using our auxiliary sends, those are what are called buses. So that's just a terminology you'll hear if you run into these things from time to time. So I have an auxiliary 1 send bus, okay, or 2 or 3 or whatever. Those are what they are. It's just a mixed signal that has a common destination. They're all going to the same spot. And the book has a pretty good explanation in there too, so you might take a look at that. Auxiliary sends are buses that are routed from each channel's auxiliary send knobs to the appropriate aux send. So from these to this. So just understand that's part of your master section. And then again, we've talked a lot about how they can be used for a special purpose. So monitors, recording, special effects, whatever. I want to come back to this discussion on stereo versus mono. A live sound system does not benefit from stereo unless the audience can hear both speakers at nearly the equal level. So if you have a lot of systems are installed with two speakers. There are some single speaker systems, and I worked on those too. But when you're dealing with 2 speakers, and you're feeding those speakers, and your faders, your pan knobs do their thing back and forth, you notice that this, from when we used it in the auditorium, these are all set to the center. And the reason for that is we don't want one side or the other. So if a singer is only in the left speaker, people on the right side of the auditorium won't hear that person very well. So unless you have a large auditorium with 20 people sitting in the middle, you do not want to use stereo in your auditorium. I want to emphasize that. Stereo does enhance the quality of the sound for a song service on recordings, broadcast, or things outside the auditorium. So if you can configure your mixer to do both, that's the best situation. So even if you're not broadcasting but you're recording, people are going to enjoy a CD in their car, around the house, on their iPod or whatever. They're going to enjoy that song a lot more if it has a nice, if it gives them the stereo image. And you can play around with it. It's kind of fun to do, to listen to those things and to just kind of set that. We do that for over-the-air sounds in the auditorium. Okay, we'll move on. Metering. You have meters here. We have meters here. They're all, nowadays, almost every mixer is using LED meters instead of the old analog meters that you probably were familiar with from your sub days. Everything we have meters on this. They're right here. That's all the metering you get. In the case of this board, we have a mixing board. I'm using mixing my mixing terms. On this mixer, we have the input channels are also metered as well, which is called a meter bridge. So it helps us watch the levels of various outputs of our mixer. Many simpler mixers have a single meter, like this has a single stereo meter that has a number of functions, but it can still do more than one thing in most cases. A meter bridge on the input channels is very valuable for blending. That's our first stop in our church when we have a singing group step up, is check, make sure that you've got levels on all the microphones, make sure those things are bouncing along where they need to be before you go any further. Every one of these is going to have a red at the top. you want to keep the signals out of the red because you're getting close to a distortion. Okay, and then they may be red and they may not. These are multicolored here. These are red, but it's going to be the top of the meter. You don't want that thing slamming. Okay. Let's talk about headroom. Headroom, the room above your head. In sound, you want to leave a voice that can get louder, some additional bars on the meter, some additional headroom above, so that you don't distort when they get louder. So I think especially of some of the preachers that you wind up having to that would be visiting, and maybe yourselves, where you're talking quiet, then you want to make a point, you talk loud. You don't want that distortion coming out at that time. So we leave headroom in those cases. So you want to leave a lot of headroom at the top of the meters. Generally, like halfway up is probably about as far as you want to go for the normal, to leave plenty of room. And it depends on how the system's calibrated, and you kind of get used to your sound system. But just avoid the saturation. A couple of other things to finish up on the mixers are inserts. An insert allows you to take the signal out of a single channel on our channel strip out to something and back in. And that could be the case where maybe we do want to run some compression on something. It would be an unusual case. Or maybe you have a special equalization you want to do because you got a really special mic that just you can't get right with that one. You want to do the equalization. So what you will do is you get an insert cable that plugs into our jack in the back here. It says insert on it. And then it has 3 wires on it. Okay. Most of the time, the signal goes out on this part here. If you see the 2 black lines on there. So we have 3 conductors. We have what's called a sleeve, a ring, and a tip. A tip being the farthest part out. Okay. So we have 3 conductors, and then one of those is ground. That's the sleeve. Okay. So this one is ground. So it's shared, both input and output. So it sends the signal out on the tip. On these, there's only 2. There's a sleeve and a tip. So it comes out on this one. Oh, I lied about it. Comes out on this one. I'm reading the labels here. And so the signal from the mixer comes out on this one. The signal comes back into the mixer through that. So we plug it in. We've just broken the feed from this to this, and we've added whatever we want to in the series with that. And that could be handy when you need to do something to a particular channel. That's the main thing to carry away from that. Okay, so you must use a special insert cable. I showed you a cable that does that. Another discussion, shifting things a little bit here. What brand should I buy? You find a lot of brand loyalty. Do I want to buy a Mackie? Behringer's has a reputation for being cheapies. Do I want a Peavey? There's a bunch of different brands out there. I believe brand loyalty is usually a bad thing. You want to spend your money for your church as appropriately as possible to get the best bang for the buck, as they call it. You want to get the best performance for the lowest price. So we say do it the old-fashioned way. Determine what you need. Do you need something like this? You're just getting started? Do you need something more along this line? What do you need to do? You just need a pulpit feeding a small amplifier with a couple of speakers that you tear down because you're in a Grange hall? Or do you need to run a big orchestra and a bunch of other stuff? Do you have a radio station? Do you have recording needs? Whatever. Determine your needs. Find a variety of mixers that fit those needs. There's a lot of them out there on the market. There's hundreds of them out there on the market. There's all kinds of brands and things with different prices. Remember that certain components have a cost if they're going to be quality components. Each one of these knobs has a certain cost to go on there. So they either put a lot of knobs on there that are cheap, or they put a few knobs on there that are good. So they're going to have to make that compromise when they build that mixer for you. So usually the cheapest and the most expensive are poor use of money. A lot of times you're buying a name, just like clothing. You're buying a name at the top end. And some of them are hand-built. Those are really expensive. We're talking 6 figures there. So at the top end, it's my firm belief that you're spending too much money. At the bottom end, the thing's going to last you a little while, and you're going to have problems with it. And how much do you want to disrupt your service with the board failing on you all the time, too? And in my opinion, these are a little low. We shouldn't be using these because they're too cheap. They have a lot of functionality and a lot of good stuff about them, but we're on a third one of these right now. So, you know, if we'd had that 3 times that money and saved it up and bought a different board that's still running now, and then by the time we need a 4th board, we're saving money. So. Okay, let's move along. In the book, you'll find that their setups are pretty good for the preacher and choir. I don't know about the worship band one there too, but as far as the preacher and the choir, they have some pretty good points. Single microphone is preferred. Pulpit, handheld, lavalier, whatever they want, obviously. Start out with the EQ flat, so we have a microphone, we get the preacher up there, we start out with the EQs all dialed in flat. We turn the monitors off, and they say to turn the monitors off based on the preference. My feeling on that is the only reason you turn the monitors off is so that you can use your ears to determine what the house speakers are doing first. You want to turn those monitors on afterwards, because I think any microphone on the platform should have monitoring. Otherwise, if you're set up well, without monitoring, it sounds dead to the person. All they're hearing is an echo out there. So they should be hearing the monitors and not the main speakers. But we turn the monitors off while we're setting up so we can hear just the main speakers. We adjust the EQ for natural sounds and volume that provides clarity without overpowering. The choir, position mics for a good blend if you have the opportunity to. Some mics can't be positioned. If you've already got them hanging up there, you know, you got what you got. Again, the EQ starts out flat. You listen for a good blend. May require some microphone adjustment if you can move the mics around, because what you want to do is pick up those voices in a nice blend. Work the EQ from low to high. That helps you to take care of kind of the bigger problems first. That does also apply to the preacher. And then you want to make sure levels are balanced with the instrumental accompaniment. You don't want the piano, organ, or whatever is accompanying the choir to overwhelm them, and you don't want it to be not heard either. So, orchestra and instruments, small groups or ensembles, and individual instruments. Small groups or ensembles and individual instruments benefit from individual mics. In other words, if you've got enough inputs for 4 instruments, then you might want to just mic those instruments independently, because that's a little tiny group you got. You start getting a bigger orchestra, you're not going to be able to do that. That's where the distance thing we talked about before would come in handy. EQ starts out flat. You want to listen for natural sound. There's some good tips in the book. I'm going to kind of gloss over this pretty fast here. There's some good tips in the book on that as well. And they talk about different instruments, and even in that worship band section, they talk about brass and guitars and things like that you might run into in many of the services that we run sound for. Okay, let's summarize. Channel strip is where all the inputs come in. So these are our channel strips, and they're just repeated, so they're not as complicated as they look. So it's good to know what each of these knobs is doing. Even if you're just running the board, somebody else has set it up, it's good to know what they do. Master section is our last stop, last chance to do something before it goes out to those main speakers. Final controls before they send it to speakers. So a lot of times, like if you have a problem, like suddenly a feedback pops up and you don't know what to do about it, and maybe you don't have a meter bridge like this, you might have to just turn those main knobs down for a moment to try till you can figure it out. So you have a chance to do something about that. So overall levels should be set there. And then become familiar with the mixer. You know, I gave you the manual. Like I say, it's not going to be tested on or anything else, but it wouldn't hurt to just open it up, look through it, even just out of curiosity, and see how they talk about their controls and things like that. And there's always things to be gleaned from that. And in something like this, you know, most of us have the habit of just tearing into the box and setting it up and then reading the manual if we really get stuck. You know, sometimes it's good to read that manual ahead of time too. So read the manual. Okay, I didn't do this last week. I need to do this every week. Just read chapter 4 and then study chapter 3 for the quiz. Again, we're going to try to have things online by Thursday. So if you have the internet access and want to review any of the class, the video should be online by Thursday. And we have 2 chances to save it now this time. We'll do our lesson 3 quiz next week. And then we talked about the makeup quizzes at the start of the class. So just let me know ahead of time, and you've got now contact information, email address, and everything else. Anybody have any questions? All right. Well, thank you for your attention. We're not going to sleep.